So, whereas the first panel discussed in very broad terms the sort of the political and macroeconomic shape of things and where the world is heading, we're going to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty. And so first, in the first panel, we had the chief executive, the trust buster, the politician and the stateswoman / stand-up comedian. Now we have the lawmaker, Irene Tinagli, who's the chair of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs at the European Parliament. We have the lawyer, Andrew Bradford from Columbia Law School, and the economist, Philippon from NYU Stern School of Business. It does sound like the beginning of a joke, the economist, the lawyer, and the lawmaker come into a bar or something. I'm the dilettante in the middle, so I'll be asking questions rather than making comments. And I think we'll start with a sort of broad, I suppose, economic lie of the land. And I'll ask Thomas to begin, taking us maybe through this idea that, that economies and industries have become more concentrated over the past 20 years. At The Economist, we have performed some sort of relatively unsophisticated analysis by comparison with what Thomas does, but it does appear that in America, at least, concentration of most industries has actually grown markedly between the mid-1990s and the sort of mid-2010s. Since then, the situation is a little bit unclear and fuzzy, partly because the data have not all come in yet. Perhaps it's begun to plateau, but it's certainly much higher than it was in the 1990s. And that, in principle, appears to be a problem. However, especially for consumer welfare, even in a narrow sense that Professor Tirole outlined in his presentation. But at the same time, we've also seen a period of historically low inflation, which suggests that prices, at least, have not been rising. I mean, obviously until the recent episode, for which there are many idiosyncratic reasons. So is concentration really a problem?
Well, it can be. It depends a little bit on where it's coming from. I think as economists, we always think of concentration as the outcome of a complicated economic process. You have firms entering, exiting, competing with each other. And so you might end up with a high concentration for good reasons or for bad reasons. So in my book, I try to tell the story of actually making markets work for people in Europe. And by and large, I come out and I conclude that over the past 20 years in Europe, markets have been working better for the people than they did before. And I think prime examples of that are the telecom sector, where everybody in Europe is paying less than half of what people pay in the US for your cell phone plans every month, and maybe less than half for your internet access. Broadband costs are much lower here than in the US. What's interesting is that pretty much the opposite was true 30 years ago. That's what the book is called, The Great Reversal, because when I went to the US as a student, they had competitive market, not very concentrated, and very low prices, especially in telecoms. So I think that my argument is that over the past 20, 30 years, Europe has done a relatively better job at making markets work for people than the US. And I think in the US, it's in part because in this grand game of trying to figure out which markets are working well, which ones are not working well, they've been biased towards being not intervening enough. And I think that even though concentration can sometimes arise for the right reason, and we saw some of that, especially in the 1990s, where firms that are doing very well become dominant, so their market share is high, so you see, well, that market is very concentrated. Yeah, but the reason it is because they just innovated a lot and improved quality and also sometimes lower prices. So that's the good side of concentration. The bad side of concentration is when firms try to prevent entry to protect their rents. In both cases, you might end up with a market that has relatively high concentration. But you need to ask yourself, why? How did we get there? And my argument is that in the US, we've seen relatively more of these negative concentration dynamics over the past 20 years, relatively less in Europe.
Irene, I would like to ask you about maybe the last couple of years and how the landscape that Thomas has drawn reflects in what has happened during the crisis since the start of COVID. So has concentration suddenly emerged as a problem in Europe, whereas it might have been concealed by certain other factors before? Have the multiple crises that Europe is now dealing with, has that brought to the fore the fact that there are certain pockets of the European economy where concentration is making the problems worse?
Well, honestly, I don't have the numbers to answer precisely that question. So this is, I would actually like to have some economists that look into that, and I don't know if they have the numbers in the last couple of year or two. That would be an interesting one. What we saw with the COVID was really a very unusual situation for us all. We had to face a situation that nobody had faced before. And actually, one thing that I want to be provocative. We always talk about the bad mergers. So this distinction, the bad mergers, the good mergers, the too much concentration, we always concentrate on the bad mergers because, of course, we are worried and concerned about what can happen to the markets, the free market, etc. I think sometimes we may want to think, especially in Europe, about what the good measures could be. Because what I see in Europe, it's still, in some sectors, a great degree of fragmentation in certain industries, a lot of national markets. And these, in some industries, can be problematic. And I think, in particular, like in the banking industry, which is the one I deal with on a daily basis, sometimes a good cross-border merger could make the sector more resilient and could help the transmission of monetary policy. So I think we need to have an open mind in trying to understand not only when to prevent the bad mergers, but also when a little bit of consolidation of good mergers could be beneficial. And what we saw, for example, some big companies like big banks during the COVID were very helpful in trying to help the smaller banks in putting out loans and guaranteeing liquidity for preventing solvencies for the smaller ones. So actually, in that case, it was a good cooperation when you had some, the big players helping, supporting the smaller players. I think in terms of the banking sectors, I don't know in other industries, but we saw like bigger, more solid players better supporting the employment, paying or anticipating money for supporting the employees. So I think that in Europe we need to think at more European level. Sometimes we are more focused at the national level. And so this is something. And one last thing is also, maybe sometimes in the past we've been a little bit naive in focusing on how to maintain competition within our internal market and making sure that, we didn't have, public support for, state aid for mergers that would hamper, but we didn't consider what was happening around the world, and maybe we have seen in the past companies that receive state aid from foreign countries and having aggressive, acquisitions or mergers in the EU. So, what is the problem? Sometimes the difference is that we do have frameworks that may allow some state aid, but we have a very strict and rigorous scrutiny, and elsewhere it's a little bit less so. So I was very happy to see that the Commission, tried to change these when we passed the foreign subsidies regulation, and I'm really, really eager and look forward to see the entry into force of this regulation, because it signifies that Europe starts to really broaden up his view and realize that we have to take into consideration not only what happens inside the Union, but also the players outside.
You mentioned the banking sector as one which is sort of perhaps concentrated at the national level in Europe, but quite fragmented at the European level.
Yeah.
I think another industry from which we at The Economist hear very often when bosses come through to talk to us is telecoms, where you often it's relatively concentrated in particular countries, but there hasn't been a lot of consolidation. And obviously, telecoms are critical for the digital transition. They also require relatively high investments, right, especially in the 5G rollout and so on and so forth. So smaller firms in individual countries just often lack the resources. There have been a terrible investment for shareholders, partly as a result. But that brings me to the sort of the second big theme of this panel, which is the idea of competition in digital markets. Obviously, the telecoms infrastructure undergirds a lot of the digital, sort of the more digital infrastructure. And Anu, I would like to turn to you, because there is a sort of the question has been popping up today throughout the day about the roles of various types of policy tools and roles of various agencies. And in the digital markets, we have obviously an active competition commission in Brussels, but we also have activity coming from the European Parliament and the Commission on the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which are two massive pieces of legislation. How do you think those two, in broad terms first, and then we can get into a bit more nitty-gritty, but in broad terms, how should they complement each other as opposed to cut against the grain?
So obviously, I think there is a broader vision that the Commission has and the European Union has to shape the digital transition. And I think it's absolutely right that you cannot do it with one policy tool alone. And I think we also need to make sure that those policy tools further the same goal, the same vision, which is this human-centric digital transformation, which is a rights-driven way of steering the digital markets. If we think about the American more markets-driven way or the Chinese more state-driven way, I think the Europeans have carved their own path and stated that vision. And that does require resorting to different policy instruments, and they need to work towards the same goal. But at the same time, we need to make sure, though, that, and I think that Professor Tirol's remarks were very important in thinking about what is the distinct role of, for instance, competition agency, and what is the benefit and what is the harm when we do overstep those boundaries and we try to burden one single instrument with too big of a load. So that's why we do have the Digital Services Act, which is trying to accomplish something complementary to what the DMA is trying to accomplish. So I think if we think, for instance, now you mentioned the sort of competition, and if you think about data privacy. So there are sometimes attempts, if you think about the German agency's attempt to pursue Facebook's data protection violations through competition law. I think it's controversial. This is now something that we will hear from the European courts, whether that is the right way to do that. And I think there can be an intellectually coherent argument of why some of the practices can also constitute a abuse of a dominant position, as the German agency has argued. But if we make this primarily a competition issue, we also are asking a lot from competition agencies, and we may be deviating them from the mission. And what I worry even more is that it may crowd out this urgent solution to bolster our enforcement of data protection and vest the data protection agencies with the tools that they will be effectively enforcing that mission. So in many ways, yes, they support one another, but there's a reason also we have a set of policy instruments and not just one.
Irene, I would like to ask you sort of to follow up on that. And how do you see the division of labor between the DMA and just the legislative side of regulating the digital transition and the competition enforcement side?
No, I think that we will have also to see it in practice. I think the big challenge we have now is also to see how it will be implemented and how it play out. And I think the Commission, as the sole enforcer, will have now a big role and try. I hope that it will be, equipped in such a way that really allows to implement the fullest and most effective way. And I think the framework that we have put in place is really indeed indeed complementary. And I think it has, the right approach in the way that, it gives the Commission the tools to intervene on a broader and preemptive way compared to, pursuing the individual cases one by one afterwards. So I think it can be much more effective. And also the fact of, focusing only on the very, very big players, the gatekeepers, and leaving untouched the medium, smaller, allow us to have this balance between, preserving, avoiding too much concentration, protecting the consumers, protecting competition, but at the same time, allowing, protecting the consumers, but allowing innovation to come up and to emerge from the market. So it's always a very fine line. And so that's why when we talk about competition rules, DMA, DSA, a lot is not so much in what you write down, but how it's been implemented. It's very much about that, I think. But it's important to have a framework that gives the toolbox and the instruments to intervene, identify, and follow up on cases. But this is the very fine line. So guaranteeing a level playing field for companies, prevent the bigger concentration to harm the consumers, so protect the consumers, but at the same time, leave space for innovation to emerge. And also, you mentioned another one thing earlier when you talked about the telecom. Innovation is preserved by allowing a broad competition with the startups and smaller enterprises and the creativity of, but sometimes innovation requires big investments. So sometimes you may need some big players in some sectors for the degree of investments that are needed to support the innovation. So you see how complex it is and how delicate this balance can be. So I think it's important, what the Commission has been doing in these years. I like the approach. It's also because it's incremental. And now we are reviewing the things that we've done. Sometimes the court reviews the things, and with the sentences we know where we are heading. So it has to be gradual. It has to be sometimes case by case, but it's good to have a framework that adapts over time, because also we have emerging challenges constantly new situations and cases to regulate. So it's not that easy.
So, Thomas, sort of a question to you about sort of limiting the power of the biggest companies versus promoting innovation, because there does appear to be a little bit of a tension in that if many startup founders would love to be the next, well, maybe not Mark Zuckerberg now, given what's been going on, but the next Larry Page or the next Steve Jobs. If you have a system where like massive success is effectively punished, or at least limited by if you become like in a gatekeeper, if you get the label of a gatekeeper, you're suddenly you suddenly have much more there are many more restrictions placed on you, and the idea that you could grow really huge therefore becomes a more distant prospect. Does that chill innovative ferment lower down at the startup level? I mean, do we have any sense of to what extent the sort of the limits on the big boys limit the innovativeness of the small fry?
Well, we have some data, we have some studies. I think in theory, of course, it's possible. If I tell you your reward is not going to be as high as it could be because once you become too big, I'm going to start regulating or putting control on you. In theory, that could have an impact, but quantitatively, no way. Because by the time you get a gatekeeper, you're so rich anyway that the incentive is there. And also, there is also another very important effect, which is by limiting the power of the big guys, you also create more room for the smaller guys. And these are the ones who need the motivation. So on balance, I think that in this industry, we would not have a chilling effect. The one thing I am more worried about is that the regulation themselves create a burden. We discussed banking before. There was a prime case in banking over the past 30 years. We had very little entry, and part of it was the regulations are so complex that little guys cannot complain. So if they can't comply, then only the big guys can comply, and then you effectively prevent entry. So sometimes well-intended, in the previous panel, we talked about unintended consequences. Well, that's one of them. You regulate, your intent is good, but the cost of regulation means less entry. And I think that's the thing we want to avoid. I think that's probably, I would argue, the most important thing to keep in mind when we review GDPR, and then when we'll do the same for DMA, DSA, which is to keep in mind that we always need to go back and ask ourselves, these regulations were well-intended, but do they put a burden on small firms? And if they do, then we find a solution. For finance, one solution that has worked relatively well so far is this idea of the sandbox, which actually is a British idea and successfully implemented there. And then pretty much everybody in the world now has something that looks like that, where the idea is to say, well, once you're young and you enter, you're going to have lighter regulation for a little bit when you play in the sandbox. And when you grow up, I put the stronger regulation on you. So I think that's the part I'm more worried about.
Yeah, so I think with GDPR, I remember speaking to many people from sort of medium-sized firms or think tanks or other organizations which found it which in principle were very much in favor of the idea and the aims of GDPR, but found compliance incredibly costly, and obviously large companies have the compliance departments, have the resources to comply with onerous regulations, and smaller firms often do not. Anna, you've been looking at European regulation and its role in sort of shaping the way that the world is going. And Europe in many ways has been ahead of the curve on digital regulation for sure. So the question is, well, first of all, are European regulations attractive given that on the surface there don't appear to be very many European digital giants? If you have a place like Europe where you don't have all that many, you don't have Le Pomme, you have Apple, right? So is the world receptive to regulations from a place to regulate an industry which that place has in itself really bred?
So I think it's a really important question, and I could say that yes, the GDPR is a prime example where the European regulations can spread and can have a local impact, can affect companies' business policies. It can affect other regulators around the world that are replicating the European example, even though there is no sort of European tech giants that can be compared to their American counterparts. But I think there is a limit to then the attractiveness of the European regulation and the Brussels effect if the conclusion is that there is a connection that people start making, associating Europe as only the regulator of technologies, but then not developer of technologies. So I think the idea that Europe shouldn't just content itself of being the referee, it needs to get on the field and play the game, play offense, play defense, and play it well. Because otherwise, I think it erodes to some extent the credibility of the Europeans, because there starts to be this association that the reason European companies are not successful is because we overregulate them. And I agree with Thomas that there is such thing as overregulation. There are such things as bad regulations. But I like to dispel this notion that the reason that the European tech companies haven't been as successful is because we are overregulating. I think there's very few in the world who are now willing to say that self-regulation is the model to go for the digital industry. And I think there are other reasons that explain why we don't have the European companies. So let me offer just an alternative reason and what Europe would need to do to generate those big tech giants. So first of all, the regulation is not the problem. It's the lack of regulation in terms of digital single market. We need to complete the digital single market. The European companies the startups needs to internationalize much earlier than the American counterparts. So this tremendous gain, the single market is still the strength, the heart of Europe. That's where our growth opportunities lie. So we need to exploit that to the maximum that we can. The second, capital markets union. It is much easier for American tech companies to raise funds in the United States. So the venture capital industry and generally it's not as developed. The European startups can raise the early rounds of funding, but when they grow bigger, they're normally then bought by Americans. And the third, bankruptcy laws. Entrepreneurship is very costly in Europe, and that deters risk-taking. Failure in Europe is often fatal, whereas in the Silicon Valley, it's just the rite of passage. You're trying hard enough, let me give you more money. So if you look at a recent OECD study, and they compare the cost of entrepreneurship, they are highest in Europe. So in Czech Republic, Sweden, Portugal, they are lowest in the United States and a few other places like that. The fourth thing, so we also need to think about immigration, the idea of where do we get the human capital for making those innovations. So why is America so successful? If you look at the over $1 billion startups in the United States, over half of them has an immigrant founder. If you look at even all the biggest tech startups there, so Jeff Bezos is a second-generation Cuban immigrant. Steve Jobs is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Sergey Brin is Russian. Eduardo Saverin is Brazilian. Elon Musk is South African. This is not just American sort of talent that is contributing to the tech innovations there. So I think there's much more that the Europeans can do, not giving up their regulation. I think that's what we need to do, and we do it well, but also be equally ambitious in completing these other tasks that can really make Europe also the generator of technologies.
So, I mean, this almost sounded like a challenge to you and the European Parliament more broadly.
I'm sorry, I really, agree on everything that Arno just said, and this is the challenge we are facing, especially on capital markets union, and it's very difficult.
So what's the obstacle? I mean, why can't Europe get its act together on this?
That's what I wonder every day. I mean, I know what the obstacle. I'm not sure I can say it out loud, but I know. So the thing is that, so if we really want, for example, you want to do an IPO, you said, my objective as a startup is to do an IPO and, at Wall Street in the US. And here, where do you do it? In Frankfurt, in Paris, in Milan, and each stock market has its own modules, its own application, its own rules. So it's not just the European regulations. Sometimes we have all these national regulations, and that adds up to that, or make the market more fragmented, make it difficult to really leverage the scale that we could leverage in the single market. And it's difficult to collect capital across the union. It's difficult to grow. We are still very much fragmented, and despite all the efforts that we've made and the progresses, for sure, the progresses that we've made, especially on the banking union, but even the banking union, which is probably the field where we are most advanced, it's still incomplete. There are still many pieces that are missing. So, and every time we try to make some step forward, of course, there are national authorities that are a little bit afraid of losing some of their powers. This would imply to give up some national sovereignty on some aspects and give it to the European institutions. So this is not an easy step to make. And
who are the most reluctant?
No. Now I already said too much, so don't make me go there. But people know. But but it depends on issues. I mean, look, every member state have, of course, their own specificities, their own topics, the things on which country A would be happy to progress on issue X, country B would like to progress on issue Z, but not the X. And so this is the complexity of the European Union. We are a diverse continent with different needs. But I think that's the challenge. And we proved that in some circumstances we could make some major leap forward. So we did it in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, because the main, the SSM, where everything, all this apparatus for the banking union, the surveillance, etc., was made after the great financial crisis. And so it means that we are capable of reacting. And we made some, steps ahead also after the COVID, the joint procurement of vaccines. Now we give it for granted, but it was a huge thing, back then. And, the Green Pass, developing this module, we have 27 different modules for everything, and for something so delicate that deals with individual health and vaccines, we managed to develop a standard that immediately could be used all over Europe. And this meant also reopening stores, activities, allowing people to move in a safe way. So we know that we can do it. I just would like to see member states and governments to be able to move even without the huge crisis upon their heads. I mean, I think we would need a little bit of a sense of responsibility that we need to keep pushing constantly and not just going with this a big push when there is the crisis and then we go a little bit back, oh, maybe I went too much, you know. Sometimes I have this feeling. And we need to realize that the more integration we pursue, and the better it is for all, for innovation, for for all these things.
So I have one follow-up question to that, and you mentioned the financial crisis and the fact that that sort of turbocharged a certain transition. Is the current crisis, or crises, because it isn't just one, right? It's sort of overlapping crisis. Do you expect that to turbocharge the developments in this particular area on capital markets, on the digital single market, or is it just something that politicians or the bureaucrats in member states will just kick down the road because they've got other things to worry about at the moment? Do you see the current overlapping crises as an accelerant or as a decelerant of this transition?
No, I see that as a big accelerator, for example, on the green transition, on the energy security, all these things that we had already started to address a few years ago now are really being accelerated. Digital market, for sure, I see that accelerating. Capital markets, banking union, not so much at this very moment, simply because actually the banking sector reacted very strongly, it proved to be very solid. We were very much afraid at the beginning of the COVID about the impact on the banking industry, and instead it proved to be actually, as I said earlier, part of the solution. Banking sector helped the transmission of fiscal policies or economic policies and monetary policy. So it proved to be resilient. So maybe now and also the massive public investment and public money now being put in certain projects may not realize how important it would be to have a real private capital markets union to keep financing the green transition, the digitalization, also above and beyond the Next Generation EU and the 2 years we have ahead. But I think that there is an awareness of the fact that we will need to accelerate on the capital markets union as well, because the green transition, the digital transition, the money that we've put on the table with the Next Generation EU is a lot of money. The money that individual member states are putting on the table to support the recovery is a lot of money, but it's not going to be enough. So we need to crowd in much more private capital to support and to complete these transitions. And so we will need to make progresses on the capital markets union. So we talk a lot with Commissioner McGuinness on this, and she's very determined. So we have already some proposal coming for the new year, the Listing Act. So we are very determined to try to accelerate also on these aspects because it will be crucial.
So, since we've touched on the green transition, this is the other big subject that I was hoping to cover in this panel. And Thomas, I'd like to turn to you again as the economist on the panel about, sort of, on the one hand, it does seem clear that the current situation and the energy crisis is, in some ways, and we've heard this today, first showing the urgency of the green transition, and also in some ways accelerating it. Are some of the interventions in the markets, such as, in effect, sort of certain types of price control or various other tools that are being deployed, do they risk, again, cutting against the grain and slowing it? Because one of the things that tends to accelerate innovation and bring new entrants into markets is the fact that the prospect of making a lot of money. So when prices are high, you typically draw in new entrants into markets because these markets suddenly seem like a lucrative place to be. So are the tools being deployed in Europe, do they risk cooling that enthusiasm?
Yeah, so I think that's the $1 billion or €1 billion question. I think maybe it's important for the audience to just have a simple framework in mind to think about what the issue is. So on the one hand, the price is a good signal, both for supply and demand. The price is high, you bring in more producers. The price is high, people have an incentive to reduce their consumption. So there's a sense in which we actually want, to some extent, high energy prices to get both the supply and the demand to move in the right direction. So that's kind of step one. Now, the problem is if the price doubles, triples, quintuples over 12 months like it has a very negative impact on the income of people. So people are going to get poorer because of that. Okay? So you can understand 90% or 80% of the discussion at the EU level as trying to strike the right balance between these two competing forces. You want to ensure people's income against this risk, which is very high prices, and yet you want to keep the price as a signal incentive for supply and demand to adjust. So how can you do that? Okay? And that's where the state aid rule is crucial. The reason is that, let me give you, the solution that we as economists would propose. So, well, it's easy. You just decorrelate, you just have two tools. So you keep the price the way it is, and you insure people based on their consumption last year. So, I take how much did you consume last year? I give you a transfer based on that times some current price. Okay? The key idea is that the income protection I give you does not depend on your current choice. It depends on what you consumed last year. So that means that the price is high. You used to consume 100, now you consume 200. Well, I'm going to give you 150 of support. So that's going to maybe take care of half of your income effect. But then at the margin, you still have the very high price. So if you find a smart way to reduce your consumption from 200 to 180, you keep the 150 of subsidy. Okay? Now, so that's kind of the standard solution that economists would propose.
Some countries in Europe have introduced similar models,
now,
right?
So then why is it that we should all do that then? Yeah, that's where the catch is. It's very expensive. And so some countries have the means to, so insurance is great. So giving transfer to people to protect them, to replace their income, that's great. And you can do it while keeping the market mechanism working. Fantastic. What's the catch? The catch, it costs a lot of money. And so some countries just don't have the means to make the transfer that would be necessary in this world. Okay? So then you have this unfair playing field across Europe because some countries have the means to do this big income transfer and some don't. And so that explains a lot of what the discussions that sometimes become a bit obscure, it's mostly about that. Okay? And the state aid rule enters in that specific region there to try to keep a level playing field across Europe. So I think that's the key. And I think as usual, we're going to find a solution which is going to be not perfect, but much better than not agreement at the EU level. That's going to involve a lot of income support, and maybe at the margin, we're going to also have some price control. So that's kind of the big picture. Now, on the price itself, there's a difference between the expected level of the price and the volatility. So there's no question that some of the short-term volatility of the price is crazy. It doesn't help anybody. Especially it doesn't give a strong signal to the people who are supposed to bring in more supply to the market because, well, they can see the price is high, but there is a chance going to be half of it in a week. So that's not good enough. So reducing the volatility of the price, that's win-win. That's separate.
Yeah. So is there any, at the European level, is there any hope, do you think, Irene, to create a system where the sort of optimal framework that Thomas has outlined, which gives support but preserves the price signal, is it possible to implement something like that at the European level? And that would sort of, certainly help consumers, but also maintain the price signals both on the consumption and on the production side.
I think it's mandatory that we find, or at least try to find, that kind of equilibrium, because I don't think that what we are doing right now is sustainable in the long run. I'll be very blunt on this, because we've been saying for months and months the situation is temporary, so please don't, just very temporary measure to support income for the families until we don't adjust inflation, energy prices, but it's going to be short term. The thing is that it's not being short term. Many countries have already put tons of billions and billions and have increased their deficits on top of what they already did during the COVID, which was already massive. Situation was a little bit mitigated by the higher inflation and VAT revenues from the energy prices, so mitigated in terms of debt to GDP ratio. So, but they can't last like that, providing massive support to families and business just because we cannot find a solution at the European level. So I think otherwise it will happen with what Thomas just said. We are really putting the single market at deep risk if we just leave the countries alone. And so it's good to have flexibility for the member states to intervene in support and relaxing a little bit state aid rules. But we cannot forget what the main purpose of the state aid rules are, which is preserving the single market, maintaining a level playing field, avoiding the fragmentation. And then this is actually what we may see if we don't find that kind of equilibrium, which can be something related to fiscal and economic policy, to find possibly a European instrument to help and support member states in this effort in supporting the income of families. But at the same time, I think that some intervention on the energy market and the price formation mechanism, because it's not just related to the, I'm sorry, but I don't want to get too much into that because I know it's a very controversial debate, but this is not a regular market where just simply supply and demand. It's a very particular market. It's already regulated. It's a very peculiar situation. We have a war. We have very few suppliers. We have also a lot of speculation going on, which is increasing the volatility, and this volatility is affecting the prices and is affecting what the millions and millions of families and businesses are paying. So, for example, just to give an example, in the Econ Committee, I started to promote analysis on the functioning of the markets for the commodity derivatives, because obviously there is something there that is pushing the prices in a way that is not related to the normal dynamics of demand and supply. So we've had hearings. We had the head of the ESMA in the hearing in the committee. We will have a special public hearing late in November, early December, trying to look into that. And we will invite also national authorities that is competent for oversighting the TTF. We need to understand, and we cannot be afraid of changing what didn't work and to try to make things. That doesn't mean over-regulated, that doesn't mean altering the dynamics, but it simply means trying to find a way to make it work better for the people. And so we have to be very pragmatic, non-ideological, and trying to see maybe what worked 20 years ago, it's not working at their best right now, and we have to find a balance. We have to find a new equilibrium, because if we don't do this, and these measures have to be coordinated, fiscal economic policy, monetary policy as well, and energy market regulation. I think if we cannot find a way to coordinate these efforts and to progress on these three fronts, I'm not sure how we'll get out of this crisis.
So just looking at a little bit longer term, Anu, you obviously mostly study digital regulation, but one of the most important bits of that is how to foster innovation, right? Because that's ultimately what leads to higher productivity, better living standards in the long run. Do you see any lessons, I mean, not necessarily in the current energy crisis, not necessarily this winter for Europe, but sort of lessons from what you know about fostering innovation in the digital markets to fostering innovation for the green transition? Because they're sort of related because they're technological. The technologies are somewhat different. The barriers to entry, capital barriers to entry, probably higher in the latter. But are there any sort of tips from the digital side that could make sure that when things calm down and the near-term firefighting is done, that the people in charge of fostering the green transition in Europe can learn something from those fostering the digital transition?
So some of my earlier comments, I think, apply to innovation in green technologies, renewables also, that also need capital, that also need the kind of spirit of entrepreneurship, that also need to be able to fail, yet continue to innovate, that also benefit from more integrated single market. So I think some of those are sort of fundamental on how a thriving, dynamic economy and innovation develops and what Europe needs to do. I think one question that is now essential in digital or in green transition and in kind of this broader geopolitical environment is that we are kind of reassessing the optimal role of state and the markets. And I think there has been a sort of acknowledgement that the state is back in, but there's also this temptation then to bring the state so forcefully in that we are moving towards on some variant of state capitalism, or we sort of relying too much on subsidy races and think about what we are now doing to try to build our strategic autonomy and our technological sort of independence, self-sufficiency, and digital sovereignty, and sort of how much do we need to do it by way of sort of what is industrial policy as such. And there I'm a little bit cautious. And I think also when we talk about whether we talk about using merger control as a tool to then build European national champions, there I hope, and I'm looking into Commissioner Vestager, I hope that we do stay firm in sort of not forgetting what our fundamental mission is, as we have pushed back, and the DG Commission has pushed back on this temptation to convert competition policy for a tool for industrial policy. And I think in today's geopolitical environment, when the entire world is getting more protectionist, there is a temptation to do that. And I think we need to think about, again, going back to the right policy tools. So, for instance, with green transition, we can be ambitious about the climate. We can try to level the playing field by looking at sort of carbon border adjustment and making sure that we have a tool. It's the fight that is worth fighting, that can be really consequential and that can be really important. But I think that we are thoughtful in how we still retain the kind of dynamism using the tools of the market, and thinking about also then the digital transition, going back to earlier conversation, how do we make sure that there will be European digital technology giants? It is not through industrial policy.
So, Thomas, I would like to turn to you with a sort of similar question, I suppose, and that's about the sort of inherent tension that Anu has highlighted between sort of trying to create companies which are capable of delivering these large-scale physical transitions, right? I mean, creating, we had Vestas here earlier. Creating large machines requires, a fair amount of capital. That's easier for large companies as opposed to small ones. So, how do you strike a balance between making sure that these companies are big enough to be able to shoulder the investment needs, while also maintaining competition? So the tension between where does the sort of wise industrial policy end and veer into something that's counterproductive?
Yeah, so I have a pretty clear-cut view on that. I think that every time you hear the word national champion, 95% of the time it's BS, and it's just somebody trying to protect their rents using that as an excuse. And the telltale sign is the rational changes with the direction of the wind. So, if people are talking about China, then everything is going to be based on, we need to be big because of China. And then that has nothing to do with China, but they use it as an excuse. And then it's going to be another excuse next year. So it's not true 100% of the time, but it's true most of the time. And then the flip side of that is, I think that incentives matter more than everything else. And so, why is Tesla an American company and not a European company? It's not because of lack of funding. You're not going to tell me that the big German car manufacturer didn't have the means to do it. They had actually more funding than Tesla ever had. Now, there was a push by the state. So that's a form of industrial policy, which is you're not picking the firm, you're picking the topic, and then you have grants, programs from the Department of Energy and stuff to promote things that you think are useful, but you're not picking winner. So this, I think, is useful, that we should do more of that at the EU level. But at the end, it was just incentives. Like, there was space, there was competition, there was an innovator. And that was way more important than just, are you big enough to, if you have a good idea and the right incentive, you'll find the money. I think that's my view of the world. The other thing is, firms that do well, even in the export market, if you look at around the world, most of them started by being pretty good at home. I mean, my favorite comparison, I take football, soccer for the British, but for the Americans, but what football, right? So, the Paris Saint-Germain in France is, dominate the national championship easily. Well, they don't do very well on the EU level. Okay, compare that to the Spanish or the Italian or the British leagues, right? Why? Because to get really good on the export market, first, the best way to get fit is to have really good competitors at home. And I think that's the key lesson for Europe, and that's what we should be striving for. So within the EU market, we should just go for competition and incentive. I think that's the key. Now, at the border adjustment, that's where it gets more tricky, and I agree with Anu that there, yes, we should be naive with respect to the rest of the world. But within Europe, I think almost all the time the best solution is let the firms compete and then have a broad policy.
I suppose with the border adjustment, we come back to the question that Commissioner Vestager raised earlier, which is the trade-off between having the cheap solar panels from China now and having the good, high-quality, inexpensive solar panels from Europe, in a few years' time. I mean, these factories don't crop up overnight. So it sort of depends on just how urgent, I suppose, you think the climate transition is. If you think that it is, much delayed and just too urgent to wait anymore, you should presumably be buying the Chinese solar panels. If you feel that you've got a little bit more time, you should be investing. Or trying to ensure that a domestic supply. So there does appear to be a trade-off there in this particular
well, that's
area.
That's the perfect example of an economic question, which is the answer is not yes or no. The answer is a number. The answer is what's the right adjustment, like is it 10% or 15%? And exactly because you want to strike the right balance between getting cheap supplies today, but also maintaining your autonomy for the future and your ability to innovate. And there, the answer is never going to be black and white. So that's where I think the black and white, honestly, the national champions is pretty black and white. I think it's almost always a bad excuse. But the border adjustment is not. It should be something which is in the middle.
Anu?
So if I can add here, I also think about the role of the European Commission in particular, thinking about the way that we view dominant companies having a special responsibility. I think the European Commission, among the competition agencies and regulators around the world, has a special responsibility. It is the leading regulator. It is the one that sets the example. And if you do believe in the idea of the Brussels effect, that the regulations and practices have an impact abroad, I think we need to remind ourselves that the Brussels effect is a good tool to export good and bad regulations alike. And if the Europeans start then leveraging their competition powers as a tool for industrial policy, that's what the European companies will be finding when they are competing in foreign markets as well. The foreign regulators would also be adopting that. So that's what I call the kind of special responsibility that we need to be mindful that the policies we implement here also spread around. And if we do invite more national champions and the sort of state-driven policies for that, we will encounter those too.
So I think we probably have time for some questions now. I see someone in the third row. Could you introduce yourself and then pose your questions?
Thank you very much. I'm Luc Hendricks. I'm the Director General of ECTA, the European Competitive Telecommunication Association. So we represent the operators that exist because of the liberalization of the market. So we defend competition in the telecom market.
Sorry, could you maybe take maybe a bit louder? Could we get?
Yeah. Can you hear me? So I'm the Director General of ECTA, the European Competitive Telecommunication Association. So we represent the telecom operator that entered the market after the liberalization and that are pro-competitive. So we defend competition on the telecom market in the EU. I have a multiple-side question and some of comments because the debate has been very, very, very interesting. And the word European champion has been mentioned a lot as well as internal market and cross-border consolidation. The first things I wanted to say, and then I come to my question, is that there is nothing in competition law that would prevent, for example, Deutsche Telekom or Telefonica to buy the Belgian incumbent, or to buy the biggest cable operator in Belgium, Telenet. There is nothing in competition law that would prevent Orange to buy the Dutch incumbent. So there are many, many cross-border opportunities where competition law is absolutely, absolutely not an issue. What we see that it does not happen because there is no economical incentive for the operators to operate in an internal market where they would offer seamless or the same prices everywhere, because they could already do it today. Vodafone could offer same prices everywhere, or they just don't do it because from a marketing and an economic point of view, it does not happen. There is today a strong call for deregulation, for less competition in telecom markets. We are totally opposed to that. When we speak about European champions, let's not forget that because of competition, we have had lower prices, more choice, better quality, better services. But not only that, more innovation. Where there is competition, there is investment. Compare France with Germany. Germany on the mobile market, there is lack of competition, no regulation, coverage is poor, service is poor, investment are poor. In France, investment are higher year after year. And in 2020, it raises 12 billion, more than 12 billion euro, if we do not look at a spectrum. Also, let's not forget that the liberalization is not only a matter of competition, it's also a matter of successful entrepreneur stories. Those are the European champions. It's Xavier Niel that started Iliad in France that now serves 1 on the 10 of the Europeans on the mobile market and the fixed market. It's Dummermont in Germany with United Internet. It's Neven Dilkov in Bulgaria with Nitera. And this is also a very strong message. They are successful entrepreneurs, and the framework has created that. And now I come to my questions. Does anyone seriously believe that reducing competition will increase investment? We spoke in the first panel about the coherence between the long-term and the short-term actions and the coherence of fighting inflation. Do we really believe that reducing the competitive pressure, reducing the regulation by artificially having wholesale prices raising is the right tool to combat inflation and having telecom prices increase? Do we really believe that increasing telecom prices will increase investment, where the stock market are totally allergic to long-term investment? If you look at an operator like Iliad, they invest for many years 30% of their revenues. They get out of the stock market.
I will stop you there because it sounds like this is more of a rhetorical question, but I will turn it into a genuine question to Thomas, and that is whether you think that there are instances where reducing competition by allowing more concentration could lead to more innovation and lower prices.
It's the dog that didn't bark. So it's possible in theory, but in practice, it doesn't really happen. I think the main reason is because we are oftentimes on the side of the. If you think about the link between competition and investment, it's possible in theory that we have too much competition. We rarely visit that part of the world because we don't get there. So we are usually in the part where we should have. If we have more competition, we have lower prices and higher investment and higher innovation. I think that's the rule. In the telecom market, it's pretty clear. Like I looked at the data in details. Every extra dollar of profit that you see in the US is a dividend or share buybacks, the same. It's not capex. So I think that's true. Again, the exception is this is all if you think about the single market and European companies competing in Europe. And also agree that the best way to get champions is to let them fight at home, and then the winner is going to be the champion. It is not always true if you think about global competition and again, the border adjustment tax. There, it's different. So,
I have a sort of follow-up question, I suppose. Maybe Anu, that's for you, and that is if. Actually, I see we have Slido questions, so I won't do my follow-up. I'll do that later. Should competition policy antitrust tackle general market failures like externalities? So should it be the role, it's basically a question that Jean Tirole addressed in his speech, should it be the role of competition policy to fix externalities and price externalities? Anu, do you want to take that one?
So I think we touched on that. It's a very important question, so I'm happy to revisit, but I think Jean Tirole offered us a framework to think about what is the downside of doing so. And ultimately also I think I would refer to when Nadia was asked this question in the first panel and said that we have first best tools that we would need to deploy to the fullest at first, and then we can think about, I think, the role of competition policy being maybe in the world of the second best, and that can offer, like that doesn't hinder, that doesn't work sort of cross purposes with having that. But I mentioned earlier that I sometimes worry that by using competition policy as a tool, we may be overloading the instrument, deviating it from its main mission, where that remains the first best and essential tool. And then we sort of are less focused on perfecting the tools that are better suited. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't sort of ensure the coherence of the domains, of different policy domains, but we also have important, direct, effective regulatory instruments that can deal with issues like climate change.
The other thing, I suppose, which is slightly different, it's a slight nuance on that, is that if you give more tasks to the competition authorities, they might, not succeed, and not succeeding undermines their credibility institutionally. So it's not just a question of them not necessarily, being torn in different directions, but it's also in the eyes of the public when they are tasked with doing this, and it's hard because it's one, n+1 task that they have to acquit themselves of, and they don't deliver. That sort of undermines the faith in the entire edifice, including the things that it does well.
Yeah, and we're asking already a lot from our enforcers. If you think about, for instance, how the DMA will be implemented, how it will be enforced, it is a tall order, and it is absolutely instrumental that the Commission will succeed in that task. And just think about everything else that we hope to accomplish in terms of shaping the digital transition through the sort of classic competition policy tools. I mean, that still needs to be the main focus.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? We have time for maybe one or two more. There's someone in the second row, I think, over here.
Thank you. Matthias from ABCO Worldwide. I was at a conference on space yesterday, actually, here in Brussels, and you had a very different discourse using the argument of strategic autonomy or sovereignty, European sovereignty, to exclude non-EU companies from certain strategic sectors such as space, and effectively reducing competition in these sectors. And it's a question to all of you, do you agree that there is an argument when it's a question about strategic autonomy to have this kind of industrial policy, I guess?
So is it?
I didn't understand.
I think the question was whether reducing competition through in certain strategic sectors by excluding non-European firms from in the area of space is problematic. Whether that you're sort of artificially constraining competition because you could have Americans, Brazilians, Chinese compete for certain sensitive contracts in space technology, but you're excluding them and therefore limiting the scope for competition in the strategic sectors. Is that the right way to go? Did I understand the question correctly? Yeah.
I think that apart from the specific case of space, in general, trying to support the idea that pursuing a strategic autonomy means excluding the rest of the world, it's not necessarily like that. I mean, pursuing a strategic autonomy may simply mean that you try to create incentives for the development of a European industry in certain sectors that would allow you to be, not exclusively dependent on things that are produced somewhere else, because what we've seen, what we've experienced, first with the COVID, with this long supply chains, but also now with the energy security, is that sometimes when you don't have industries or supply chains well developed in the European Union, you rely entirely on other jurisdictions. That can be really a problem. So that doesn't mean you have to exclude. This means that you create incentives to develop and strengthen an industry in Europe. As far as specific sectors are concerned, the idea of excluding depends on how you interpret the strategic in certain sectors. It's always a little bit tricky. I would also suggest here to look at what other jurisdictions are doing, because I think that, as I said earlier, sometimes we have to be not too naive and look at what others are doing, because sometimes we don't see when we pursue this kind of openness, which we've done, because I think the European Union is the most, open jurisdictions in terms of trade, in terms of, we need to pay attention at the degree of reciprocity, and it's not always the case. So I think that maybe in certain specific sectors, we might want to consider that, of course, with a grain of salt, because I'm a open free market kind of person, and I'm always very careful when you restrict things. But I've also seen in the past the price that we've paid for being sometimes a little bit naive in approaching this.
I think it's interesting. I mean, the problem with strategic autonomy is that politicians have a tendency to bloat the meaning of strategic to cover an awful lot of things.
Exactly. So we have to be careful in how we define that.
Yeah, yogurt is not strategic.
No, yogurt is not strategic. Yogurt is not strategic.
But the French would have you think it is, because then you need the
I mean, if you go to a Carrefour and you see, I mean, there's a lot of competition in yogurt in France, that's to be sure. But I mean, these things come up everywhere. I remember when I was looking into this a few months ago, I found out that Marco Rubio in America thought that sugar was the strategic asset. I mean, in America perhaps, but it sort of seems a little bit far-fetched. But thank you very much. I mean, we've run out of time. This was a wonderfully dynamic and somewhat too consensual, I suppose. I mean, it would be not maybe a few more sparks can fly in during lunch, to which we are now probably going to proceed. But I'd like to give a warm round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much to you for sticking around, and hopefully that wasn't just because lunch is about to be served. And thank you for all your questions.